Hello, I am Morgan and welcome to the Sleep Hub. We bring you the most peaceful and relaxing way to fall asleep while listening to voice audio documentaries. No music or noise, just the sound of my voice guided by relaxing rain and thunder sounds. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Good night and sleep tight. A man known to history as Nostradamus was born in 1503 as Michel de Nostradamus. The exact circumstances of his birth are unclear, but he is believed to have been born in December of that year in the province region of southern France, most likely on either the 14th or 21st in the town of Saint-Rémy de Provence. His father was Jean or Jacques de Nostradamus, a notary who worked for the government in Provence. Michel's mother was Rainier, a granddaughter of Pierre de Saint-Rémy, a prominent physician in the town of Saint-Rémy. Jacques and Rainier had at least 9 children, though the precise number is unclear, a not unusual occurrence in a time of patchy birth records and high infant mortality. The Nostradamus family had a somewhat shadowy background, and there is little information about Michel's childhood. Jewish people had come under severe persecution in France and other countries such as England in the High Middle Ages, with governments issuing orders for them to either leave those dominions entirely or convert to Christianity. Many converted but continued to practice Judaism in private. The Nostradamus family held out for many centuries to come, in part because the weak, decentralized nature of the French crown made royal enforcement of such directives in regions such as Provence difficult. Evidently, though, the pressure to convert was significant enough by the mid-15th century that Michel's grandfather, his father Jacques' father, a man named Cresquas, of whom we know little other than he worked as a moneylender in Avignon, decided to finally convert to Roman Catholicism. When he did, he adopted the Christian name Pierre and the surname Nostradamus, which means Our Lady, a symbol of his having converted on Our Lady's Day, a significant religious festival at the time celebrated on the 25th of March. Michel's Jewish background may have been somewhat significant. There was a major strain of mysticism and esoteric knowledge involved in Jewish literature and thought in Europe in the late medieval and early modern periods, ones which influenced Michel's later writings. Foremost here was the Jewish Kabbalah, a school of thought in Jewish mysticism which sought to explain the relationship between an unchanging, eternal God and the finite world of mortals. This focused on sacred texts, many of them away from the mainstream of Judaism, and a good deal of which utilized language and rituals, which were open to myriad interpretations. The language could often be vague and of an apocalyptic nature. For instance, the most central text within it, the Zohar, is a group of books offering mystical commentary on the Jewish Torah. Significantly, the Kabbalah emerged most strongly within the Jewish communities of Spain and southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries, and so the Nostradamus family were most likely exposed to this extensively in the centuries that followed. Scholars have long noted the influence of the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism on Nostradamus' later writings. We know almost nothing about Michel's earliest years. A theory that he was educated in his childhood with his maternal grandfather, and it was from him which he gained some of his earliest training as a physician, is certainly spurious, as Pierre de Saint-Rémy died when Michel was still an infant. What is clear is that in 1518, when he was 14 years old, Michel entered the University of Avignon, one of France's oldest universities, having been first established in 1303. There he began studying for his baccalaureate, a degree which, like nearly all educational curricula in Europe at the time, was heavily centered on grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the works of Greek and Roman writers such as Aristotle and Cicero. However, Michel's time here was cut short by a major outbreak of the bubonic plague in southern France, one which forced the college authorities to close the institution. This was standard procedure at the time, and when major plague outbreaks occurred, those who had the means to do so tended to flee from cities and towns to rural areas to avoid the crowded urban settings in which disease proliferates. The closure of Avignon in the late 1510s inadvertently led to a formative period in Michel's life. He took the opportunity to begin traveling widely, and it was during this period, when he was moving around Western Europe, that he seemingly undertook much of his initial training as a physician in an informal capacity. Unfortunately, we have few precise details of what exactly he was doing during these years, or where he was undertaking his studies, but we can glean much by assessing the state of medical knowledge in Europe in the 1520s. This was a time prior to the medical revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries, when the first scientific assessment of how to treat ailments began to be undertaken. Instead, the treatment of illness in the 16th century relied to an overwhelming extent on practices with little medical efficacy, particularly bloodletting, the practice of drawing off a significant amount of blood from a sick individual. Owing to the belief inherited from Greek and Roman physicians such as Galen, that the body's health was based on the balancing of humors such as bile, it was believed that bloodletting could serve to recalibrate the body humors. Elsewhere, medical practice was based on folk remedies and limited forms of surgery. A huge array of ailments which we would consider minor today could result in death in the 16th century, owing to the unavailability of basic medicines such as penicillin, and the fact that there would be no vaccines available for another 2.5 centuries. Given this, the medical knowledge which Michel would have acquired in the 1520s was as much based on folk remedies and sheer hope than it was on any hard science. The details of Michel's life become somewhat clearer in the late 1520s. He had evidently established himself as an apothecary in southern France at some point in the mid-1520s, and in 1529 he decided to acquire greater knowledge still, in his field by attending the University of Montpellier. The University of Montpellier was home to one of the oldest formal medical schools in Europe, having been established here as far back as the 1130s, though this was predated by the medical school founded in Salerno in Italy in the 11th century. However, Michel's time here, like his sojourn at Vagueness a decade earlier, did not last long. Within weeks, the college authorities at Montpellier had learned that he had worked as an apothecary prior to entering the university. This was a clear violation of the university statutes, which prohibited students from having previously engaged in a manual trade at a time when Europe's universities were still the preserve of the affluent sons of the nobility and the gentry. Thus, just weeks after he arrived there, Michel was expelled from Montpellier. A copy of his expulsion order has survived, and is found in the archives of the University of Montpellier to this day. While he would doubtlessly have seen his expulsion from Montpellier as a setback, Michel, who was still just in his mid-20s, seems to have taken the rebuff as a motivation to further his own personal studies and business. Thus, in the course of the early 1530s, he began to specialize as a plague doctor, the kind of physician who, in the early modern times, treated those afflicted by the monstrous bubonic plague. Though it is most usually associated with the apocalyptic Black Death outbreak of the 1340s and 1350s, one which killed upwards of 1/3 of Europe's people, the plague continued to strike at different parts of Europe with regularity over the centuries that followed. It was particularly common in southern France, which lay along the main trade routes between Italy and northern Europe, the passage of people through which often led to outbreaks such as that which closed Avignon when Michel was there in the late 1510s. Despite its virulence, methods for treating the plague remained limited, though the effectiveness of social distancing and quarantining were well known. Thus, the term quarantine itself derives from the Italian for 40, the number of days which ships were required to wait at anchor in the harbor of a port like Venice before unloading their goods. If they were coming from a region where there was known to be a plague outbreak, Michel's method for fighting the plague was the use of rose pills which he devised himself. These consisted of a mix of rose petals, sawdust from green cypress trees, cloves, calamus and lime aloes. These by themselves would have been completely ineffective. But in tandem with his rose pills, Michel also directed individuals in a plague-impacted town or village to ensure that the bodies of those who died from the disease were quickly removed and buried, and that surfaces were washed and kept clean. He also recommended to people that they get plenty of fresh air, and, unlike the vast majority of his contemporaries, he didn't recommend bloodletting as a way of staving off the disease. Thus, while his rose pills were useless, Michel's prescriptions around sanitations were positive. These sanitation measures must have been effective for, in the early to mid-1530s, his reputation as a plague doctor grew around southern France, and he was regularly called upon by communities where disease had broken out to visit them and offer advice. In time, this ensured he became financially independent. For instance, when the plague broke out in Aix, the capital of Provence, in the late 1530s, Michel headed there and helped the city authorities stop its spread. They subsequently rewarded him with a pension for life for his services. Michel had also married by this time. In 1531, he had taken up an offer presented to him by Jules Caesar Scaliger, an Italian physician who was living in the town of Argent in southwestern France. Once there, Michel married a local woman whose name was possibly Henriette d'Henaucourt. They quickly had 2 sons together, but the marriage ended in tragedy when Michel's wife and 2 children were themselves carried off by a plague outbreak in 1534. It may have been his personal tragedy that caused him to redouble his efforts at developing methods of stopping the virulence and spread of plague, and his time at Agen was significant for other reasons. Scaliger, who had first invited him to the town, was a formidable scholar with a reputation throughout Europe, one who had engaged in debates in print with Desiderius Erasmus, the leading European scholar of the first half of the 16th century. Thus, while in Agen, Michel was able to make use of Scaliger's extensive library. While we cannot be sure what he read here and how it influenced his subsequent writings, doubtless anything he was perusing in print during these years could be viewed as an influence on Michael's subsequent written works. In 1538, an event was to occur which would influence the course of much of the rest of Michael's life, and with that which we may never have heard of him today. That year he was accused of heresy in France. This was a dangerous time to be seen as a heretic. The Protestant Reformation had swept across Germany and was beginning to infiltrate large parts of Western Europe, France included. Fearful, no doubt, of extraordinary punishment, Michel did not attend his trial and effectively went on the run. Much of this was within France itself, and it appears that his crime, whatever had led him to being accused of heresy, was limited enough that he was able to continue working in Provence and other regions. However, he also traveled further afield, to Italy. It was here that he established contacts within the printing industry, the capital of which in southern Europe was located at Venice. Though he did not begin publishing just yet, Michel would soon, and it would be owing to his Italian influences. Meanwhile, in the mid-1540s, he returned to France, where he was yet again involved in fighting a plague outbreak in the city of Marseille. Shortly thereafter, he finally settled down in Salon de Provence, and it was here in the late 1540s where he started a second family after marrying an affluent widow by the name of Anne Ponsard. They would have 3 sons and 3 daughters in the years that followed. Moreover, between his wife's own financial means and the extensive pensions and payments he had accrued himself as a plague doctor over the years, Michel was in a position to settle down as a writer as he entered what we would now term middle age, but which at the time was seen as old age. Michel's authorial career began in 1550 when he published his first book. This was an almanac, a kind of small booklet or pamphlet. These short and cheap publications were the foundation of the publishing industry in 16th century Europe, a time when full books were still expensive to produce, but small 8, 16, or 32-page booklets could be mass-produced quickly and sold for a reasonable price. Accordingly, almanacs on all manner of different subjects, from the religious disputes which were ongoing between Catholics and Protestants to agricultural matters and recipe books, were produced across Europe at the time. Almanacs were a kind of subgenre which offered information on a subject relevant to that year. Michel's first one was on astrological predictions, and he was inspired to write it after visiting Italy again and meeting with his acquaintances in the publishing sector there. Here he took the decision to Latinize his name and identify himself as Nostradamus on the cover, a flourish of showmanship which would have enduring implications. The almanac was a commercial success, and in the years that followed he continued to publish at least one on an annual basis. Unfortunately, despite the fact that they sold well at the time, copies of these have generally not survived down to the present day. And it is generally not possible to determine how Nostradamus' prophetic writings evolved in the early 1550s from the almanacs into what would later become his more well-known prophecies. We do know the general structure of the almanacs. These consisted of 12 4-line long poems or quatrains, ones which offered predictions for the coming year, couched in rhyming language. These were written in vague, esoteric, almost secretive language of a kind which was certainly of interest and peculiar to the mid-16th century reader, and which also had the added advantage of being open to a very wide interpretation. They were instantly popular, and as they were, Nostradamus determined that they were a good format for him to continue writing in. Thus, even as he was producing his annual almanacs in the first years of the 1550s, he was also conceiving of a much more extensive project where hundreds of quatrains would be written on a vast array of supposed future events that would occur in Europe and beyond. He was encouraged in this by his growing reputation as a clairvoyant and mystic in southern France during the 1550s, and as his almanacs became well known, it was common for wealthy French nobles, merchants, and members of the gentry to seek him out for his thoughts on their affairs and what the future might hold. Then, eventually in 1555, he published the first section of his great work, which he termed the Centuries originally, but which he eventually named the Prophecies, and published the first volume of Asle's Premiere Centuries, aux Prophecies, at the city of Lyon that year. The Prophecies consist of 942 quatrains spread over 10 centuries. This was the cumulative amount which was eventually brought together and published as a single edition in 1568, shortly after Nostradamus' death. However, the publication history was fragmentary, and the first edition, in 1555 for instance, was restricted to 353 quatrains and a preface. Much like his almanacs, these were rhyming four-line poems which offered highly ambiguous prophetic statements about what might occur in the future. For instance, one of the very first quatrains stated that, when the litters are overturned by the whirlwind and faces are covered by cloaks, the new republic will be troubled by its people. At this time, the reds and whites will rule wrongly. This is ambiguous enough that people of future years and generations could read very many different things into it at different times. Moreover, because the prophecies were not said to have specific reference to individual years, unlike the almanacs, the contents of these quatrains could, theoretically, relate to an event at an indeterminate point in the future. It was this combination of vagueness and prediction that would eventually allow Nostradamus' prophecies to be interpreted in a seemingly limitless number of ways. The topics covered by Nostradamus were varied but tended to center on what might broadly be termed political and social events. There was extensive talk of kings and queens and empires and kingdoms throughout the prophecies. Much of it was also historically rooted, with reference either to people and places from the distant past or to the passage of time beyond Nostradamus' own time of writing, as one would expect from a work of prophetic rhymes. An indicative passage was the following towards the end of the first century of quatrains. At the time, Cyprus will be frustrated of its relief by those of the Aegean Sea, old ones slaughtered, but by speeches and supplications their king seduced. The Queen more. Elsewhere, famous heroes of the ancient world such as Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general who marched with elephants over the Alps at the start of the Second Punic War with Rome in the 3rd century BC is mentioned. Other passages mention Greek and Roman gods and goddesses frequently, while Nostradamus was also preoccupied by weather cycles and the movements of fleets on the great seas. Unsurprisingly, he was fascinated by wars and natural disasters, and the prophecies are effectively an endless catalogue of awful events and periods of turmoil yet to come in human history. The geographical range of the prophecies was very considerable. The editions of the book which were printed included subtitles such as "represents part of what is now happening in France, in England, in Spain, and in other parts of the world," indicating that Nostradamus perceived his work as relating to events which would occur well beyond the parochial concerns of southern France. For instance, place names which are given in the text include references to parts of Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, Eastern Europe, and the Ottoman Empire, which at the time had grown to encompass much of the Balkans, Middle East, and North Africa. Some of this was indicative of the times Nostradamus was living in. When he was born in the first years of the 16th century, Europeans had just discovered concrete ways of traveling around Africa by sea and to the Americas by sailing westwards from Europe. The prophecies reflect the revolutionary changes which were occurring in European conceptions of geography, and indeed the myriad new peoples they were coming into contact with as they voyaged out ever further from Europe. It is also telling how specific many of the references were. He is often not just referencing countries well away from France, but individual cities and islands. Closer to home, there are scores of specific cities, towns, and provinces in places like France, the Low Countries, and Italy directly mentioned. Given his concern with classical motifs, the names used by the Romans for parts of Europe were also often employed. More broadly, the fact his work covered such a large array of geographical places has made Nostradamus' works more timeless and pertinent to a greater array of people than they otherwise would have been. As esoteric as Nostradamus' writings were, hundreds of years of scholarship on the prophecies has revealed that they were written in a fashion which drew extensively on specific sources. For instance, Nostradamus was often anxious to mimic events surrounding kings, queens, warlords, kingdoms, and empires in his quatrains, with talk of plagues visiting empires such as Rome, rulers being overthrown, and great changes striking republics and kingdoms. In order to acquire inspiration for how he wrote these quatrains, he delved deeply into classical history, reading works like the Lives of the 12 Caesars, written by the Roman historical biographer Suetonius, and the comparative historical biographies of eminent Greeks and Romans, composed by the 2nd century AD Greco-Roman historian Plutarch. Elsewhere, he consulted more contemporary prophetic works by religious figures, such as the writings of Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who established a brief-lived theocracy in the city of Florence in Italy in the 1490s. We know this because the very earliest stages of the Prophecies contain a series of biblical quotes which are written in an almost identical order to how Savonarola had used them in a text he wrote over half a century earlier. The similarity in the choice of biblical quotes and their arrangement is too similar for it to have been coincidental. Another major work which he utilized was the Mirabilis Liber, or Miraculous Book, a compendium of predictions by Christian saints and divines which had been collected since the 11th century, which was only finally published in France in 1522. Many other passages of the Prophecies have been found to extensively utilize similar texts or paraphrase entire passages. How Nostradamus used the texts which he employed as source material remains a matter of considerable academic dispute. Some scholars believe his reading of them was ordered and systematic, with the French doctor leafing through volumes in his study in Salon de Provence until he found passages which inspired him. However, others whose views on Nostradamus are admittedly less favorable propose that he simply threw open books like the Mirabilis Liber randomly and drew inspiration from what was written on whatever page he landed on, fashioning prophecies out of the contents of these haphazardly chosen sources. Exactly what mental space he was in as he conducted his work has also been widely debated. Advocates of Nostradamus have been keen to view him as meditating in a special way before he was inspired by some prophetic vision in his study, perhaps by flame gazing or some other transcendental approach. But in the only extant pieces of writing and personal correspondence in which he actually described his writing method, Nostradamus stated that he merely tried to attain a position of mental calm and tranquility before preparing his quatrains. There was nothing mystical in his process, and he repeatedly denied that he was a prophet of any kind. We have to also examine Nostradamus and his work against the intellectual backdrop of the 16th century. This was a time when the scientific revolution was in its infancy. During Nostradamus's lifetime, Nicolaus Copernicus would publish on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, a work which revolutionized European conceptions of existence in identifying how the planets of the solar system orbited around the sun rather than the Earth being the center of existence. It was also a period when the new Renaissance learning which had emerged in Italy during the 14th and 15th centuries was spreading north over the Alps to France, Germany, the Low Countries, and England. The Protestant Reformation began in Germany in 1517, calling into question all of the established beliefs of the Church, and Europeans were beginning to explore the world. The Americas were discovered by various Italian, Spanish, and English mariners in the 1490s and 1490s and 1500s, while the Portuguese had discovered the sea route around Africa to India and China. In the early 1520s, when Nostradamus was just entering his adult years, the first circumnavigation of the globe was accomplished by a Spanish expedition led initially by Ferdinand Magellan. Everything at this time was open to interpretation, and every year brought the possibility of unique ways of viewing the world. Such a world was conducive towards individuals like Nostradamus, producing prophetic and esoteric or secretive works of the kind that he did. A strain of European intellectual debate in the 16th century which was particularly relevant to Nostradamus' writings was the revival of Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. These were intellectual movements that had emerged in the last centuries of the Roman Empire and which focused on esoteric or secret forms of knowledge. For instance, Hermeticism, the name of which was taken from the late antique movement associated with the fabled scholar Hermes Trismegistus, focused on areas of study like magic, astrology, and alchemy. These were real subjects of scholarly dispute in Europe in Nostradamus' time, and formed the basis of the scientific studies of many scholars like Giordano Bruno, a 16th century Italian scholar who blended astrology, proto-science, Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism together in his work, and Sir Walter Raleigh and John Dee in Elizabethan England, each of whom were looking to find the philosopher's stone, the substance which it was believed would allow individuals to turn any substance into gold. Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, astrology, and prophetic writings were all part of the mainstream of intellectual discourse in 16th century Europe, and Nostradamus was very much writing within this tradition. Our own scientific age might look about these forms of inquiry as backward or primitive today, but the reality is that this open-minded form of intellectual exploration was a key element of the development of the scientific revolution. Thus, Nostradamus was writing at a time when individuals such as himself, with a background in medicine and proto-scientific inquiry, were often incorporating astrology, prophecy, and other forms of esoteric knowledge into their writings. Nostradamus' writings, though, are not remembered today for the intellectual landscape in which they were written, but for their alleged predictions of major historical events. One of the more striking of Nostradamus' prophecies, which is believed to have come to pass, concerns the Great Fire of London. In early September 1666, a small fire in London spread until it burned down a huge proportion of the city. The death toll was relatively minor, but it destroyed most of the medieval city. In its aftermath, many fans of Nostradamus began to point towards a specific quatrain in his prophecies which seemed to predict this. This read, quote, "The blood of the just will commit a fault at London. Burn through lightning of 23rd the 6th. The ancient lady will fall from her high place. Several of the same sect will be killed." This has been interpreted as a direct prediction of the Great Fire, most obviously because of the specific references to a great burning of London, but also because the reference to 23rd the 6th, which could be interpreted to add up to 66. However, there was no lightning involved in the Great Fire. Rather, it started in a baker's workshop. Very few people died, unlike Nostradamus' reference to several of the same sect being killed, and the reference to an ancient lady has no obvious reference to the political circumstances of England at the time. Nevertheless, the Great Fire and the seeming reference to it further augmented Nostradamus' reputation in the latter stages of the 17th century. While his prophecies did range over a wide array of geographies, inevitably there was a particular focus on France and French affairs. Unsurprisingly then, avid Nostradamus readers have identified several major events in French history which the Provençal plague doctor was believed to have predicted. The most prominent was the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. There is an extensive series of quatrains in one of his centuries which foretells a time of great strife and civil discord in the country, followed by a new ruler emerging. Here Nostradamus states, quote, "Of a name which was never held by a French king. Never was there so terrible a thunderbolt. Italy, Spain, and the English tremble." This certainly fits with Napoleon. He came from a Corsican family of a middling social class, one which was actually more Italian than French, and which had never been anywhere near ruling France in the past. His wars did involve England, Italy, and Spain, and the Spanish Peninsula became a key center of the Napoleonic Wars from the mid-1800s. However, the skeptic might note that times of civil strife usually result in the emergence of entirely new ruling dynasties, while Italy, Spain, and England, as three of France's immediate neighbors, would be the most likely to end up at war with France. Another major political figure in modern European history, who Nostradamus is alleged to have foreseen the emergence of, is Adolf Hitler. One of Nostradamus' quatrains runs as follows: "From the depths of Western Europe will be born of poor folks a young child, who by his tongue will seduce a great many people. His fame will spread to the Orient." The more extended section within the centuries explains how this individual will engage in villainous, wicked, infamous oppressions, and also refers to an adultering dame, which proponents of the view that Nostradamus predicted the rise of the Third Reich suggest is a coded reference to Nazism. This section ends by referring to the earth being rendered a horrible black in countenance as a result of the actions of this individual and his followers. A whole slew of other quatrains are also noted as being relevant to the general course of the Second World War. For instance, one section which refers to a large mastiff being driven from a city and then surprise at an alliance which is formed could be read as referring to England being driven from France and Paris in 1940, and the somewhat unusual nature of the alliance which was briefly agreed between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia between 1939 and 1941. Elsewhere, Nostradamus is believed to have predicted the nuclear bombings of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, at the very end of the Second World War. The passages are admittedly very tenuous. For instance, Nostradamus stated, quote, "Within 2 cities there will be scourges the like of which was never seen," while elsewhere he foretells within the same quatrain that famine within plague will occur. Some have viewed the latter phrase to be a reference to radiation sickness. In any event, the reference to 2 cities has a long-standing literary significance, stretching all the way back to the Old Testament, and Nostradamus' decision to use this phraseology was not unusual. Other quatrains, which are entirely vague, have been applied to prominent political events. 18 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, many individuals noted the significance of Nostradamus' statement that, quote, "From on high evil will fall on the great man." Others noted that the same quatrain went on to state, "A dead innocent will be accused of the deed." These are wholly vague passages, and belief in the idea that they refer to JFK's assassination assumes that Kennedy was both a great man and that Lee Harvey Oswald, his supposed assassin, was innocent of the crime. Surely one of Nostradamus' most famous prophecies concerns his supposed prediction of the attacks on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Centers on the 11th of September 2001 by Al-Qaeda. It is hard not to see why. The relevant quatrain states that, quote, 2 steel birds will fall from the sky on the metropolis. The sky will burn at 45 degrees latitude. Fire approaches the great new city. Immediately a huge scattered flame leaps up. Within months rivers will flow with blood. The undead will roam the earth for little time. The 2 steel birds here, which Nostradamus refers to as falling from the sky on a great city, is a striking statement about the planes which crashed into the 2 towers, while the scattered flame, which he refers to as leaping up, would certainly match with the inferno which was unleashed above downtown Manhattan that morning in 2001. Moreover, the reference to rivers of blood being shed within months is a striking portent of the fact that the United States would invade Afghanistan just weeks later, and later Iraq in response to the attacks. Fans of the significance of Nostradamus' prophecies certainly have a strong argument that quatrains such as these are strikingly prophetic. And then there are the more recent events still. Many have noted the relevance of a quatrain pertaining to 2022, in which Nostradamus stated, because they disapprove of his divorce, a man who later they consider unworthy, the people will force out the king of the islands. A man will replace him who never expected to be king. Some have seen this as being a reference to Prince Charles' divorce from Princess Diana and the negative public sentiment which attached itself to him as a result. Charles has recently ascended as King Charles III of the United Kingdom, and some have viewed this quatrain as being an indication that he will be forced to abdicate, perhaps in favor not of his eldest son, Prince William, the designated heir, but his younger son, Prince Harry, a man who never expected to be king. Other quatrains have been identified which seem to predict the war which has been in train in Ukraine since the spring of 2022, and even passages which predict the disastrous consequences of climate change. In the latter respect, the quatrains referring to the sun becoming so hot that the Black Sea will boil are particularly relevant, with Nostradamus consequently predicting that the denizens of the Mediterranean and nearby regions would be starved owing to the changing weather patterns. Of course, all of this raises a question. If Nostradamus allegedly predicted so many of the era-defining historical events, then what might his prophecies have had to say about events to come in the 21st or 22nd centuries? The portents are mixed. NASA and Elon Musk might be disappointed to learn that Nostradamus poured cold water on the idea of a successful colonization of Mars, stating that, quote, the light of Mars will go out. He also somewhat worryingly seemed to predict a great war would break out in 2023, but that it would only last for 7 months. But perhaps the most disturbing quatrain of all predicts a breakdown in the global food chain and the advent of a real-life version of The Walking Dead. In what must surely be one of his most upsetting quatrains, Nostradamus informs us that, quote, ... so high will the bushel of wheat rise that man will be eating his fellow man. Thus, Nostradamus' predictions of future events are not for the faint-hearted and should probably be avoided by anyone with an overt tendency towards panic shopping. A major issue which needs to be taken into consideration when assessing Nostradamus' prophecies is their inherent vagueness. This was not just in terms of the esoteric rhyming language used, but also in terms of other methods Nostradamus employed to deliberately shroud what he was saying. The Frenchman was writing at a time when charges of being a prophet or proponent of dark magic could bring about charges of heresy, an experience which Nostradamus had already had in the 1530s and which he had no wish to repeat. Accordingly, when he wrote the prophecies, he used a mix of different languages, including French, Provençal, Italian, Latin, and Greek, in a deliberate effort to disguise what he was saying in places, and allay any doubts that he was an agent of the devil. Moreover, some specific place names and other words which he employed can be interpreted in a completely tangential fashion. Such is the case with his reference to Rousseau in one instance, which analysts have taken to refer to the 18th century Swiss philosopher. But Rousseau was hardly an uncommon name in the Provence region in the 16th century. More tellingly, many analysts have insisted that Nostradamus' reference to Hitler in Germany, in one of his quatrains, prophesied the rise of Adolf Hitler. That is, until such time as we consider that Hitler was simply a name for the lower part of the river Danube in the 16th century. Thus, in addition to Nostradamus' prophecies being incredibly vague, there are manifold issues with how modern readers have read them without any awareness of the 16th century context in which they were written, or indeed the many classical and literary allusions which are contained within them. One final point which should be noted concerning the overall structure and content of the prophecies, and indeed their vagueness, is the lack of specific dates. One would think that in a collection which set out to provide prophecies of future events that it would be necessary to provide a great many dates, but in actuality for the period between 1588 and the year 3797, Nostradamus only references 9 specific dates. Subsequent readers have sought to suggest that other elements of the text make it possible to identify the general period in which an event would occur, such as the reference to the Great Fire of London, which occurred in 1666. However, there is no doubt that the lack of dates is a serious issue when evaluating Nostradamus's work. He himself explained this away as being a product of the book's cyclical notion of time, one in which the events of the past, when the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans ruled the Mediterranean, through to his own day and centuries into the future, all had a kind of timeless quality, in which wars, natural disasters, and political swings to and fro were repeated. But despite his statements about what he called transmutations of time, Nostradamus was simply adding an additional layer of vagueness and uncertainty to his text by generally refusing to add any details that could tie his prophetic events to a specific year or date in the future. Curiously, for a text which has gone on to become one of the most instantly recognizable works of the last half a millennium, the Prophecies were not initially well received when the centuries of them were published in Lyon in 1555. Such was the esoteric nature of Nostradamus' writings and the portents of doom contained within them, that many people suspected him of being a proponent of dark magic or an occultist. Michel may have been concerned enough by the suspicions raised at this time that it led to him burning several of the more controversial texts which he held in his study and salon. However, despite the tepid initial reaction, his publishers agreed to continue publishing additional centuries of quatrains in the years that followed, and as sales picked up, additional editions were published in Paris. The work, which Nostradamus intended to run to 10 full centuries, amounting to 1,000 quatrains, was never finished in its entirety. Nostradamus's death prior to completing the work in the mid-1560s would ensure that, but it was very close to completion, and so in 1568 the first full volume of 942 quatrains was published. It has been speculated that a small number of previously unpublished quatrains which were added into this full edition of 1568 were the work of another writer, but in any event the overwhelming majority were indisputably the work of Nostradamus, and formed the basis of his prophecies such as they have been read, studied, and commented on ever since. The almanacs and the prophecies were not Nostradamus' only written output in his later years. Among his other works is a text which he composed at some date in the 1550s on Egyptian hieroglyphs entitled the Oros Apollo. The text comprises 182 verse epigrams and concerns the nature of Egyptian hieroglyphics, the system of symbols and pictograms which were used as a written language in pharaonic Egypt between the 3rd and 1st millennia BC. Nostradamus' work was almost entirely based on the hieroglyphica written by Horapolon of Mantius, a Greek scholar who lived in Egypt in the 5th century AD at a time when the Eastern Roman Empire still held sway here, and Alexandria, the capital of Egypt in the north of the country at the time, was still one of the world's great centers of learning. Though in decline, Nostradamus had presumably relied on a translation of Horapolon's work from Greek into Latin, which had been completed some years earlier by a French scholar by the name of Jean Mercier. Nostradamus did add some of his own commentaries briefly throughout the text. What is unusual about these is that, to the world of 16th century France, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics were a complete mystery. They would not be translated successfully until the 19th century following the discovery of the Rosetta Stone by Napoleon's forces in Egypt at the end of the 1790s. It is interesting, though, that the French astrologer and seer, whose writings were so consumed with esoteric knowledge, showed an interest in a secret indecipherable language of the ancient past. Nor was this his only other work in line with his long experience as an apothecary physician and plague doctor. Nostradamus also composed a number of works in the 1550s on medical topics. The principal such text was a work on cosmetics and medicines, published in 1555. This was referred to as a cookbook, included recipes for preserves, and is a good example of the peculiar manner in which the preparation of medicines could overlap in the 16th century with other pursuits. Whether one was making health foods or cosmetics, all involved ingredients derived from nature, and thus could often have strikingly similar properties. For instance, a recipe early on in Nostradamus' text was for nutmeg oil, an ingredient which was variously used for medicines, makeup, and for cooking with. Elsewhere in the text, Nostradamus provided details of how to clean and whiten one's teeth, or to make an aphrodisiac. Around the same time, he was also working on a paraphrased translation of the protreptic, a medical text written by the ancient Roman physician Galen over a millennium earlier. Thus, what should be clear from all of this is that, while Nostradamus is almost entirely remembered for his prophecies today, he was working on a wide array of written texts and translation on many different matters in the 1550s. All this scholarly work and published output soon increased Nostradamus' fame in France beyond what he had ever enjoyed as a successful plague doctor back in the 1530s and 40s. Eventually, Nostradamus' range of admirers stretched all the way to the royal court in Paris. Back in 1533, the heir to the throne, Prince Henry, had married Catherine de' Medici, a scion of the powerful Florentine banking and political family. Eventually, in 1547, she became Queen Consort of France when Henry ascended as King Henry II. Catherine brought a Renaissance Italian's love of astrology and almanacs with her to France in 1555, and after coming across Nostradamus' almanac for that year, she summoned the Provençal seer and doctor to Paris. One of the quatrains in his almanac for that year hinted at a threat to the royal family, and she wished to learn more. Though initially fearful for his life, he was received warmly by the Queen. Thereafter, she regularly corresponded with him, seeking advice about future events. Then, following her husband's death in an unfortunate jousting accident in 1559, she effectively became regent for her sons who were still too young to rule in their own stead. Catherine's faith in the Provence seer's prophetic abilities was cemented by that time. Nostradamus had, after all, written in one of his quatrains a few years earlier that, quote, "The young lion will overcome the older one, and that it would come about by a ruler being pierced through the eye." A prophecy which became highly relevant when Catherine's husband was killed by having a piece of a joust break off and penetrate into his eye and his brain. Thus it was that under Catherine's patronage in the 1560s, Nostradamus was promoted to the positions of a royal counselor, and also as physician in ordinary to the young King Charles IX. This brought Nostradamus an additional pension and some considerable protection against any charges of engaging in heresy or dark magic thereafter. The sign of his growing affluence was seen in his and his wife's investment in a scheme launched in 1556 by the French engineer Adam de Carpon to build an extensive 25-kilometer canal to bring water from the river Durance to Salon de Provence with the goal of irrigating what was a region prone to summer droughts. The Nostradamus owned a 1/13th share in the endeavor, and it proved to be so successful that de Carpon subsequently extended the canal all the way north to the river Rhone and south to near the Mediterranean coastline at Istres. As a result of this, as well as his many pensions, which accrued over the years for his work as a plague doctor and a physician, along with the royalties from his growing body of published works, the Nostradamus family were able to live a relatively comfortable life in Salon de Provence in the 1550s and 1560s, though he, his wife, and 6 children remained in the same small house in the town, which is still standing today, and which indicates that his was no lavish existence by any means. By the 1560s, Michel was suffering from increasingly ill health. His primary affliction was gout, a type of arthritis which manifests in periodic bouts of painful inflammation of the joints. Despite his patronage by the royal family, he experienced one last clash with the church authorities in the early 1560s, when he was briefly imprisoned at Marignane on the orders of the local bishop. However, this was not on account of any charges of heresy or occultism, but rather because he had failed to acquire the necessary permission from the local church authorities before publishing one of his almanacs. Such permissions were increasingly necessary in a country where the church authorities were anxious to screen any works for hints of religious dissent, as France descended into a series of religious wars in the early 1560s, which would last for the next 4 decades. By the mid-1560s, Nostradamus' illness had deteriorated to the point where his gout was causing oedema, a disease which results in major fluid retention and then swelling around the body, and which, in a chronic state, can severely impact on one's mobility. In the summer of 1566, his situation had deteriorated to the extent that he put his legal and financial affairs in order through his will. His estate, which he bequeathed to his wife and children, was substantial, though not lavish. He died shortly afterwards, either on the night of the 1st of July 1566 or the early morning of the 2nd. The story, which was related afterwards, that he had told his private secretary, Jean de Chavigny, the evening beforehand, that he would not find him alive at sunrise, seems a little too good to be true. Though, no doubt, such a prophetic prediction of his own demise did nothing to harm sales of the first full edition of the Prophecies when it appeared 2 years later. He was buried in the Franciscan church in the town of Ceylon. Nostradamus's tomb has had a strange afterlife which has reflected the Provençal prophet's own rather peculiar afterlife as a writer. When he died in 1566, he was interred standing upright in the church of the Cordeliers of Ceylon in Ceylon de Provence. There he rested for over 130 years, until in 1700 the town council determined to move his body to a more prominent crypt in recognition of his lasting fame. During the process of doing so, a necklace was found on his skeleton bearing the inscription 1700. The townspeople quickly reinterred him following this ominous revelation, the details of which may have been elaborated. He rested again for 91 years before a group of soldiers from the French Revolutionary period drunkenly broke into his tomb in 1791. The tomb was only restored following the intervention of the town mayor, who convinced the soldiers that Nostradamus had not been a nobleman. Nostradamus had the last laugh, however, as he had once foretold that evil will come to the man who opens the tomb. The soldiers were apparently attacked by some counter-revolutionary forces not far from Ceylon and killed to a man. It is a fitting end to the strange intersection of fate and the prophecies of Michel de Nostradamus. Over the centuries, views regarding Nostradamus' reputation have varied markedly. For much of the time since his death in 1566, attitudes towards his writings were positive. For people living through the calamities of the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries, his talk of kingdoms experiencing disaster after disaster resonated. His reputation was enhanced following the Great Fire of London, which was noted as being a first major event that he clearly seemed to have predicted. Unsurprisingly, new editions of the Prophecies continue to appear. There have been over 200 editions of the work since the 16th century in many different languages, and it is one of the best-selling books of the last 5 centuries by this standard. Sales were particularly strong during periods of crisis, when fans of the French plague doctor dipped in and out of his writings in search of supposedly prescient remarks on coming misfortunes. This high regard for Nostradamus reached its peak in the 20th century, when his writings were picked up on as having predicted Hitler, the nuclear bombs, and the Kennedy assassination. Quacks emerged in tandem with authors of books on Nostradamus making claims that they could communicate with the Frenchman from beyond the grave through hypnosis. Many 20th century books on him were reflective of the interest in dark magic and occultism that peaked between the 1960s and 1980s. As well as this, elements of Nostradamus' life story became exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Recently, a more stark realism has set in, and several studies have appeared since the 1990s which attempt to refute the idea of Nostradamus as a genuine prophet and instead highlight the vague, unspecific nature of his predictions. Today, Nostradamus is a major figure in popular culture. Very few people have ever sat down to read a copy of his prophecies. Yet, at the same time, very few people are unaware of who the 16th century French prophet was. His name conjures up the idea of a long-lost seer who predicted regular periods of doom gripping humanity in centuries to come. Accordingly, his imprint on popular culture is extremely wide, with dozens of best-selling books having been written on the Provençal astrologer, as well as hundreds of television shows and documentaries relating to his prophecies and how they have been interpreted. Several films have even been made about Michel de Nostradamus, including a short film nominated for an Academy Award in 1941 and a feature-length documentary narrated by Orson Welles in 1981. The title of the latter, The Man Who Saw Tomorrow, gives a flavor of how Nostradamus is usually depicted in modern popular culture. More recently, the French plague doctor has even popped up as a figure in the Assassin's Creed series of video games, with a character having to solve a series of riddles in Paris allegedly created by Nostradamus. Thus, the ways in which Nostradamus has featured in popular culture down to the present day is as varied as the manner in which his writings can be interpreted. Michel de Nostradamus' writings have certainly fascinated readers for centuries. His life story itself is rather less examined, and indeed, as we have seen, there are substantial sections of it for which there is an almost total lack of detail, particularly so in his earlier years. But what is perhaps most striking about what we do know about him is that he did not have any special background at all in astrology or the dark arts of any kind which would have facilitated his writings. Rather, his principal profession during his working life was as a physician and a plague doctor. He acquired quite a considerable reputation for his work in southern France, but in reality his abilities in this field were more to do with his common-sense approach to sanitation than any alleged efficacy conveyed by his rose pills. But what was perhaps more notable about his work as a plague doctor was that it afforded him enough financial success in the 1530s and 40s that he was able to dedicate himself largely to writing in the 1550s and 60s. Secondly, it led to him traveling widely and coming into contact with scholars who broadened his literary range. But thirdly, and perhaps more importantly, this life as a plague doctor who saw death and devastation wherever he went must have imbued Nostradamus with a deep sense of foreboding and dread, or certainly, at least, a preoccupation with death and destruction. This preoccupation is surely the most defining characteristic of the Prophecies. A casual reader of the hundreds of quatrains which Nostradamus published in the 1550s and 60s will not be greeted by an overtly positive array of rhymes, but rather continuous portents of death, hell, destruction, fire, droughts, famines, and plagues. This was Nostradamus' stock and trade, and surely what has held the attention of so many people ever since. Had he written hundreds of quatrains on topics such as boat building or dressmaking, they would most likely have been forgotten about a long time ago. But the preoccupation with death and destruction, along with the inherently vague and esoteric manner in which the prophecies were written, have ensured that they have survived the test of time. 35 centuries after they were written, men and women still pore over the quatrains of doom, seeking hints and predictions of future apocalyptic events, and such was the manner in which Nostradamus wrote his verse, that given a long enough time, an event can nearly always be found to correspond to a passage. What do you think of Nostradamus? Do you think his writings were prophetic, or were they just ambiguous enough that subsequent generations have been able to read an enormous amount into them? This was the story of Michel de Nostradamus. I hoped it helped you fall asleep in a peaceful and soothing way. Subscribe to the Sleep Hub channel for more sleep documentaries, and I'll catch you on the next one. Good night and be safe.